If not, I can
Lucia.
play with
Yeah, Lucia, could we please unmute subtest, please?
Hi, I am trying to unmute subtest, but it won't let me for some reason. Just a second. Yeah, it shouldn't be muted. It should be on.
Hello.
Hello.
Good, you can hear the room. That's good.
Yes, if anyone can't hear the room, please comment, let me know.
No problem.
Hello, hello, good morning. Good morning, good morning. Good morning, order, order. Wow, that works. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to try and get us started. I know a few people are still filtering in, but we have a tight time schedule, so let's go. My name is Liz Carmichael. I'm the convener of OxPeace, and I'd like to welcome everybody here and everybody online very warmly to this, the 14th OxPeace conference. For those of you who are here, the housekeeping is conveniences are in that direction, and there will be coffee opposite in the auditorium at 11. And then lunch will be in the auditorium as well. So thank you for coming, and we thank all our speakers for coming. We will have one speaker online. Unfortunately, Phil Clark is very sorry he can't be here because he's tested positive for the bug, but he will hopefully be appearing online in the afternoon. So without more ado, I'm going to introduce Richard Kaplan, who is going to chair this first session. Richard, if you'd come up. And we're absolutely delighted to have as our first speaker, John Paul Liederach. Thank you, John Paul, for coming and being with us. So.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think for many of us, this is one of the first, if not the first, actual in-person conferences that we've been able to attend in a long time. And it's very exciting to see everybody live rather than on Zoom and Teams as we've been accustomed. It is both a pleasure and an enormous honor to moderate this first session. We have two very distinguished speakers, Professor John Paul Liederach and Dr. Tanja Paffenholz. I'm not going to provide details about their biographies. You will find those very well laid out in the program, but I just want to emphasize that these are two individuals who, in my humble opinion at least, have made very, very significant contributions both to the ways that we think about peace, peace building, peacemaking, mediation, and also both have been very much engaged in practice in very, very significant ways. So we're very fortunate to have them both with us today to offer reflections, in one case, as I understand, looking back, and in another case, looking forward, although I expect that we'll probably get a mixture of both with each of them. So I invite you both to join on the podium here, and then I'll yield the floor. John Paul, to you first. When I do that, it's just as easy as traffic.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. This is, in fact, my first post-COVID meeting, so it's wonderful to be in person with all of you. And having not done this for about 3 years, where I could basically sit in my pajamas and talk to people from Zoom, I actually don't know if my talk is 20 minutes or 50, so we'll see how it goes. I'd like to start this by telling a little story about two books that I don't think you've ever read, and that I never actually wrote, sort of, and that appeared for a while and then disappeared. And there's something significant in that process that I think launches our topic today about who builds peace. So without further ado, this is the book cover. If you can, take a close look. It's a little puzzle like you might get in the paper. What's different between this book cover and this book cover? I wrote this manuscript beginning in the late 1980s. It took some time to reach publication. And when it came back to me the very first time, it came in the version that you saw first. And I was stunned to see that my title had been edited. I had not used the word development. It was the word reconciliation. And as I went through the book, I discovered that a lot of my concepts had been completely edited out and placed into a different language. When I called the next morning, the editor was quite deeply surprised and had not realized that that had happened. And they pulled the first book and delivered the second one by changing the title, without changing the other things in the book that had been edited. Significance, it's hard to know. They say that sometimes the hardest movement is from category 0 to 1. Clearly, the word reconciliation made no sense in the world of the early 1990s, dominated primarily, I think, by modalities of conflict resolution and approaches to agreements. This is probably the one that you're more familiar with. Came out in roughly the mid to late 1990s. Sustaining reconciliation was, for me, part of the challenge that I was after in wanting to place as a centerpiece of the work that we do in peace building, the notion that it is about relationships. It is about the way that we understand them and see them. So as I was preparing this particular talk, I started to go back and look at the evolutions of my own thought in reference to the title. And so I'm going to share a fourth book title here with you. My guess is this is really going to get ancient, because this was the title of my dissertation. That blue book in the middle. I'm sure none of you have seen that one. Of Nets, Nails, and Problemas. It's kind of an everyday view of conflict and the language of conflict in Central America, which was in the period of the 1980s, where I spent most of my time. Since very few of you will probably be familiar with this, and no book was written out of the dissertation other than a short, small one in Spanish, let me share the three concepts that sat center in this book. They basically were what I called the TNT of Peacebuilding. That was the English translation, if you will, of three terms that were quite common within Spanish. Confianza, Enredo, and Koyuntura, for those of you that are Spanish speaking. Trust, hard to translate the term Enredo, but some form of tangled networks, entanglements, and timing. None of those terms actually do justice to it, so let me try to walk through a bit of this. Let's take Enredo as an example. Enredo is built on a fishing net metaphor. To be enredado, to be tangled up, red is the word that they use in Spanish for net and for networking. And if you can see here, people that work with nets have to work with a spectacular capacity to hold a great deal of knotted complexity. And often in the use of nets, a great deal of balance. In Enredo, you had a concept that conflict was like a tangled mess that required very careful repair. And the stitching and the repair, the bringing back together of what had been torn, when it was placed into its point of purpose, when it was working again, it remains a knotted whole, still somewhat of a tangle. The connections are constant. Peace building here would be understood as untangling and repairing. Once whole, the net remains knotted, connected in order to serve purpose. Take the word Koyuntura, which is in essence a kind of a reading of the moment. What moment are we in? What's the current circumstances that we're in? The ability to read time and space held together. Within that, it's absolutely critical to have a sense of place, relationships, history, and the emergent future. Those are all held in reading the moment, if you will. Local context remains absolutely key and grounding. Without it, navigation through the mess cannot be easily found. Take Confianza as an example. Confianza is trust, essentially, but it's much more layered in Spanish than we often attribute to the word in English. And certainly more layered than the professionalized, often instrumentalized notion of a mediator, for example, role acceptance as a form of trust. Trust is basically embedded within an understanding of relationships. In the context that I was in the 1980s, it led into the notion of the inside partial approaches to handling situations of conflict. Rather than bringing people who were outside and neutral, which was the more dominant figure of the mediation, the inside partial was based on the ability to navigate a whole series of networks and relationships that permitted small sets of people to bridge what had become massive divides, but from within the context where they lived. I imagine if we looked at these three concepts, what you would find are really three keys. One is the significance of context. The second is the significance of connections. And the third is relationships as forming a web of resources for finding a way forward, by way of often very patient stitching of mutual humanity. Those were the things I was finding in the everyday language of people when they talked about the situations of conflict that they were experiencing. I start in part with this view of Enredo, and here a massive net of someone's sitting in the middle of it, in part because it also helps me situate a bit of the topic that we're going into, but also my place within that as a practitioner scholar, which over the years I've placed those two in that relationship, practitioner scholar. I come from a messy tradition of participant observation, qualitative research, of being a part of something and understanding yourself as a participant, while you at the same time try to both observe what unfolds and reflect on the emergent that is coming, while it is still in its unfolding. Over time, I noticed this about my messiness. I basically never said the same thing twice about any of the things that I experienced. My language was in a constant evolution of trying to find something that didn't quite exist. Maybe a little like the fact that sustainable development matched the language of officialdom. But sustainable reconciliation was so foreign that it had to be translated back into what was known. I have found this to be a constant search for what is both elusive and impermanent. Violent conflict, by my experience, is filled with so many things that are lived, observed, and experienced, but that we have inadequate language to fully describe. Peace building in many regards is a mystery in the midst of that messiness. It's a journey to enter in and sit with, and then try to name the unspeakable. And that has been both, in my experience, both a delight and a dilemma that seemingly poses for us a number of paradoxes. So going back these last few weeks in preparation for coming here and reviewing my own work, I noticed 4 evolutions that I'd like to share with you. The great advantage of being a true scientist is you never hold your theories too tight. Hold them lightly. They're not exactly like your children that you have to run around and protect. Knowledge building is the ability to notice that things are stated and observed in ways that they appear, but with time, they evolve. So here are some evolutions. The first for me comes around the paradox of complexity, which was what I was experiencing primarily in the 1980s. And in that evolution, I recall a very particular conversation, 1990, soon after I had returned from an intensive decade of engagement within the civil wars, primarily in Nicaragua in the 1980s. And a researcher came to my office, I think from Germany. I can't recall exact location. She was writing a piece, it wasn't Tanya, unless she tells me afterwards that was me. I think we met later at Stade Schleining. But this person posed to me the question of the conference today. This is 1990. So it means that this question has been haunting us for a while. Who builds peace? What's your theory? What's your approach? And what I did, which is fairly typical to my way of talking, if I can see it, I can understand it. If I can't see it, I can't understand it. So I took out a napkin. We were sitting in a snack shop having a coffee, took out a napkin, and I started what I call the napkin doodle. And it started by drawing this little pyramid. And essentially what I said was, I have just come from a decade of experiences where most of my time was spent in communities that have been absolutely destroyed by war. They are deeply divided locally. But over a course of years, I came into a process where I was a part of a team helping to create a national level of negotiations. That was very few people eventually sitting around a table that could only handle about 8 or 10 around the immediate table. And it was a view of change that was driven more by a viewpoint of top down. At the same time, where I spent most of my activity and engagements was in local communities spread across the whole of geography. And in that wide dispersed geography, there were many, many people, but mostly invisible. And they were often talking about how do they access influence into things they care about in their communities and in their country. And in the middle, which was this small team of people that I was working with, were people who had connections up and down. That is, that they could knock on the door of the Minister of the Interior and get an appointment. They were actually people who knew and had lived with the heads of the militia groups and could go at any time to speak with them. But most of their work were through organizations that were touching the communities in the east coast of Nicaragua. And what I found in this was essentially that this was something, and I put a question mark here by it, that I didn't know how to name. Already in my naming, I could find very little where I was trained and had grown up in the work of peace building that named with clarity a notion of community-based, local, grassroots, bottom-up. That already was something that had not found its due course. Much less this thing that seemed to move between the community level and that thing you see at the top over there, which looks like a table of about 8 people. And what I described was what it felt like to travel between those realities. To be one day in a community and the next day in a 5-star hotel. The completely different realities of what you're experiencing, coexisting, and in principle, purporting to build the same thing. Much of what I found was gaps. And I think the 2 biggest gaps I noticed when I felt like Alice in Wonderland, gap number 1 was so much of what we talked about in reference to that top table area, drew from the language and experiences of diplomacy, international diplomacy, applied into the context of internal but deep-rooted and often Civil War level conflict. Within those concepts of diplomacy, there was almost a non-existent concept of grassroots peace building. Did not even have much room to exist. The second thing I noticed was there was very little understanding of a relationship-centric view of how social change happens. It was driven much more by questions of power, questions of compromise, questions of documents, proposals, and arriving at a solution. I think that what I was experiencing was complexity. And I was trying by way of this napkin doodle to describe complexity. And that complexity is essentially about multiple actors who sit in different places in the situation, different locations, who are involved in different sets of initiatives. And that multiplicity happens at the same time. In other words, it's multiplicity plus simultaneity. The pyramid approach, to a large degree, was trying to make sense of the multiplicity. What I found at a later point, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes, was that the hardest part of complexity is actually around the challenge of simultaneity. So that, in large part, was the complexity. And while computer graphics could not capture what the napkin doodle did, 10 years later in the book, The Moral Imagination, my father, who was a far better hand than mine, drew all of my graphics by hand because I no longer could take the computer-based graphics that became so rigid. So you see on one side, that's roughly mid-1990s, and on this side, 2005. You can see some evolution coming. You can see it coming back to the original doodle in some ways, because in that original doodle, the complexity question I was after was this: is it possible to hold at the same time relational spaces and levels? Levels and abstraction around what happens in society in reference to leadership and representation. Relationship meaning they're actual existing relationships. And I would often find myself, when I was talking about something like you see on the right here, about vertical and horizontal relationships, that I would have to draw them in forms of overlapping circles, or circles that at least gave some sense that they were spheres of connection. And this, for me, was an evolution that was significant, to come back to the notion that there is a deep tension between levels and relational connection. I think probably, though, the hardest part of it was simultaneity, and neither of these diagrams really related to the challenge of simultaneity. The emphasis was more on who the actors are. Our systems of response to complexity, I think, especially in peace building and probably the whole field of international relations and diplomacy, are organized much more around fragmentation, much more around our specializations, our preferred actors, but we have a kind of unassumed acceptance that the processes that we propose and engage in require sequentiality. They require complexity and simultaneity to fit into a process that's defined by steps and stages, by this before that. But the reality that I lived consistently was that was not true. Everything happens at the same time. And this, I think, posed a very significant paradox that I've dealt with. And of the things that were carried forward after the publication of that first book, the one that carried the widest echo, I guess I would say, was the notion of the middle out. So this leads me to my second evolution, the paradoxes of interdependence. The middle out was something of an innovation, and people found that it fit certain locations that they had. This was particularly true of the NGOification of much of peace building. The challenges that come from this, I found coming to me from two sources. The first source was students. In case you haven't figured this out yet, students are the universe's gift to undress the inductive theorist, the person that's creating all of this theory, and then they show up in class and say, "Professor, yes, but." And a lot of the yes, buts that I was getting was essentially, how could you name this middle out if these people are not leaving the situation? They're engaged within the context. They're talking about relationships that they have to build within that particular location. It's not about them leaving it and then trying to act on it from outside. It's about them being a part of it. And the second place I got a lot of yes buts was from local communities. Their single biggest issue was this. You talk about bottom up, but we know the experience of bottom up. When representatives go from our community up, they go and don't come back. It's just upward movement out. That does not attend, even though they claim to be stakeholders, it does not attend to the deepest aspirations that we have as communities. So how can you have a middle out if the people that are wanting to go are just trying to get up there someplace to be something? It only replicates. So I was getting hit from all sides. This is the good part about being inductive in theory. You know, theory doesn't mean it's concluded. Theory means my best guess for now. And you come back to test. And what I found pretty consistently was I located two sources that influenced my thinking. The first source was that I was being drawn ever more into conversations with diplomats. This would have been in the mid-90s to the early 2000s. And in the diplomatic world, there were a few spokespersons who were offering to be teachers to other diplomats. And I sat with one of them one day and heard this story. And this is the basic story of how to be a good mediator. And the essence of the story was built on a metaphor of a funnel. So the diplomat teacher was saying, it's a messy world out there. And if you want to be a good mediator, you're going to have to understand that where you want to be is at the gateway, the fulcrum of the funnel. Because you want to make sure that everything comes through you. That was the idea. Everything comes through you. Now, that funnel notion, I think most of us would raise some questions, especially if that diplomat happened to be from Washington, D.C. and was an American, about how control is exerted on people to follow certain ways that the process must be controlled. This was laid side by side with an experience I had with my son, who at the time was about 10, watching television, and we saw a movie of how a spider makes a web. And I got captivated by listening to the language that the web watchers, scientists who study web making, the language they used to describe the web. And that was part of my evolution, because their language offered something that I had not seen before or heard in quite the same way when it was applied to peace building. And essentially in this moral imagination book, this was the drawing of the evolution of a web, where my focus was more on the structure of the web, the anchor points at the far edges of the space to be covered, the crisscrossing creation of hubs, the ways in which you work both at the periphery and at the center, the movement of radii that connect back and forth. There were a whole range of things that for me created a language to describe a structure that I found interesting. but it also described some of what I had traveled and connected to and understood. This was in large degree the challenge of trying to figure out how you connect into that question. Is it possible to have relationships and levels? You may notice where my failings already come forward in that last drawing, that the web, even though my father did a very good job in drawing it, the web never fits neatly in the pyramid. It's a range of things that are happening, that these two worlds are actually quite different. And I think what comes from that is that the notions that you're dealing with are the deep paradoxes, the profound paradoxes of interdependence, in which each piece is needed, but each piece only rises to its fullest potential when connected to others. And that, for me, began to draw me in this following direction. Less emphasis on the structure of the web, more attention to the movement of the spider that I'll come to in a minute, but also that the core of the work required a profound humility, a curiosity, and a patience. Curiosity, patience, and humility, however, were not the mainstay of what I found being taught in Peacebuilding 101. So I will tell you from personal experience that I can recall of absolutely not one, no significant moment in peace building when I felt in control. In fact, I would wager that if you do not feel tiny, if you do not feel tiny in the vastness of what we're facing, you have not arrived at an adequate understanding of what the vocation of peace will require of you. Maybe several very stark antonyms would help. The antonym of curiosity is arrogance. Arrogance is, I know it all and I don't need you. The antonym of interdependence is not independence in peace building. The antonym of interdependence is the pursuit of control, to make it only function by way of me, mine, and ours. This led to a third evolution, the paradoxes of coordination. And the paradoxes of coordination were a very interesting process for me, but it had to do with observing more carefully the movement of the spider, but also considering back in my own experience how it was that ideas themselves emerged and wider consensus was developed. I used to teach the book Building Peace, and there's a chapter in there titled Coordination. And whenever I taught that chapter, I would tell students up front, this is the weakest link in the whole book. This is the hardest thing to wrap your head around. I don't think we have it yet. And for me, that has remained true. I think there is, in many regards, something more akin to 1,000 conversations that are happening simultaneously than to the notion that somehow coordination is about the task of bringing it to one location by way of a funnel. Now, what I came to eventually was that I located a definition of the paradox of coordination, but it came from entomology, not from sociology. Entomology, the study of insects, in the 1950s, identified a research question, which was this one: how do collectives cohere around common purpose without centralized control? What were they studying? Well, they were studying ants and termites and bees. And they landed on an answer to the coordination paradox, which was the way that coordination without centralized control happens. They put a weird name on it. stigmergy. Stigma, you may know, as a negative way that you pocket somebody according to the way they look or who they are, or where they come from. Stigma actually means a mark or a sign or a scent. And in entomology, it was primarily that the way it happened was that ants or termites left a scent in the landscape. That's the literal terminology of the finding that answered the question. And that where the scent was left, others followed and added. So that you get the kind of movement that you may see here. Where's the resource? How do we bring it where? The trails that are unmarked are known by way of travel that's gone before, by circulating back and forth. I actually found this quite riveting because some of what comes from that is a very different way of understanding bridging, for example. How ants will cohere around gaps, the ability to hold, and maybe even a capacity to move vertically, who knows? But what comes with the scent in the landscape is that it's very possible that there is existing a significant and important tension between circulating and convening. I'm about to head into the mainstay of the sacred cows of our field. So bear with me for a moment. I think that many of our models are based on some form of representation that requires some form of funneling in order to get to the process by which we can manage the sequentiality and decision-making that then is offered back to the whole. And that this is and will remain among the greatest fragilities that we have in our work. Circulation at its essence is when there are conversations moving around the landscape, actually moving and traveling. And when I began to look back at my own work, I would speculate, if I'm honest about it, I would speculate that very possibly 90% of my time in real life practitioner work on the ground, 90% of my time is probably around stitching the 1,000 conversations, moving from community to community, engaged in ways that you're involved in what we might call collective empathy rather than individuated empathy. Collective empathy would be to sit long enough to see how the world feels and looks from that street corner, from that village, from those porches. To understand that that conversation requires going around and coming back again and going around and coming back again, because at every iteration, and that was the language I began to evolve, itinerate, iterate, evoke. At every iteration, you pick up and you drop, you pick up and you drop. As ideas emerge and begin to find ways of cohering, this is quite different than convening, where in some form or fashion, somebody has to control the large numbers in order to get to those who will sit at that table. That, for me, led insight into why it's so hard to shift mindsets. Why is it so hard for us to shift from event to deeper, more prolonged process? Why is it hard for us to move from solutions to generative platforms that can continuously put forward ideas that are emergent around what is in the context emerging? Why is it so hard that we want to focus on picking the fruit rather than dedicating ourselves to the permanence of seasonal unfolding, of understanding that it is the ground and the ways that everything interacts that's key? This led to my fourth evolution. This will be the last one, and I'll get to my conclusions. Paradox of in-betweenness. Many of you know that for quite some time, I've been a proponent of the centrality of the arts in peace building. My basic view is that much of what we do requires a creative act, because we have to get through what exists to something that's not quite there yet. We don't always envision ourselves as artists. We envision ourselves as technicians. And I think it is a limiting aspect of what we do. Creativity is so significant. I learned long ago in Northern Ireland that, from a good friend who said, you know, conflict is known, peace is the mystery. Conflict is known, peace is the mystery. And I think within that, the artist Debussy had it right. Music is what happens between the notes. Music is what happens between the notes. I don't think that one or the other can exist without each other. They're not exclusive. But there is an emphasis on something here that is happening in between. And I'm not sure how to illustrate this, so here is my very difficult try. I think it has to do with how we focus in and where we have access, that we then create a frame of reference that gives us meaning. And what we choose to focus on in the frame we have is often limiting us to a small piece of a complex puzzle. So let me see if I can illustrate it. We may see a rising bud of new growth. We may see the green moss and the ground from which the bud began its growth. We may see the rain that is descending all around that growth. And at times we may step back just far enough to see that they're held together in some way, that they interrelate. We may see the eye of something that seems significant and arriving. We may see how that eye is attached to wings that are landing. But we don't always see the whole of the picture. Every one of those was a small frame. And in some regards, it's a little like what we do in peace building. We take note of what it is that we think is significant. What is clear is that it is much harder to notice their presence together. It's much harder to notice and see what lies between the elements of an ecosystem that makes that ecosystem come alive and stay alive. An ecosystem understanding depends much more on making visible the in-betweenness. And I think that that is at the essence of coordination and interdependence. It requires that the core of peaceful change is not primarily in what is immediately visible, but in how we attend to the essential, mostly invisible tissue that keeps us and the ecosystem whole. So, coming back to my conclusions, I often find myself making a full circle in some ways. It seems that for years, this is what it feels like in peace building. Sitting with a massive tangled mess around us and attending with hands to that which we have some access to. I wonder, even in the framing of our question, who builds peace, does that nudge us in the direction of isolating the who, as if the Holy Grail will be located in a given person, a group, an idea, an initiative, a particular proposal, all of which seems to subtly push us, nudge us into the pursuit of control around coordination. But the narrow focus on who and coveting control create traps. And I guess that's what I'd like to leave today. I think they limit appreciation of profound interdependence. They tend toward toxic forms of power. Perhaps the ancient future that we need is some notion of how to build a different, healthier ecosystem of alongsideness and in-betweenness, the ability to be present and nurture the less visible stitching that braids the whole. I think our dominant models that we've lived with for decades need to find a new iteration. I don't think we'll face climate change. I don't think we'll face what's emergent in many parts of our world by replicating the models that have had the level of fragility dependent upon sequentiality and, to a large degree, forms of representation. We will have to find this movement from 0 to 1. I'm not sure fully what it is, but I think it's got something to do with trust, connective tissue, and the permanent preparation of the messy net by way of untangling and repair. Who builds peace? My 5-word answer is, I think it's the ecosystem. The sum of the parts has always proven bigger and different than any individual. Perhaps ecosystem would also help us defocus the stitcher and refocus on the stitching, to bring into focus that which lies within and between us, the ways in which the quality of our presence and the quality of our relationships unfold with myriad ways of participation, connection, and coordination, constantly moving and weaving this permanent impermanence without centralized control. I think it's the patient stitching of impermanent peace that we need to find a way to evolve into. Thank you.
Thank you very much for getting us off to a great start. I think that we'll be coming back to a lot of the themes that you've introduced this morning. And without further ado, because I'd like to take full advantage of the limited time that we have available, I'll invite Tanya now to join the podium. And time permitting, we'll have some comments, questions at the end. Otherwise, we'll have to reserve this for later in the day. Over to you.
Thank you. I will first say a few words about your presentation and then move on to what I want to say. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It's fantastic to be with you and also to bringing all of us together. We haven't seen each other in a while, only on Zoom. And I wanted to just relate to the presentation would basically mean to give a whole, I think, seminar. Probably we could go on for a whole master program in kind of analyzing where we came from as a field and what our theories are, how we have developed, how not. And so I think it would be wonderful, and I'm very tempted to do it, but I think probably not now, because then we would. So, but what I wanted to take up is a few points. So one thing is what you said. What you said is, yeah, I don't know. When I'm not there, I have this tendency. No, it's fine. I can stay here. I'm just, I'm a bit of a mover, but I can do. So what I really want to highlight, why I think Jean-Paul Lederach is wonderful, not just because he's a wonderful human being and person, but also on the one hand, what you said, what he has given to us as a field, like the concepts, the ideas. But I think I've learned a lot from you, not only like conceptually, but also like the way, and I remember when we first met, we had heard of each other. I was a PhD student at the time, and I was about to meet Jean-Paul Lederach. It was very exciting. And we were in the same training, actually training a group of Eastern Europeans. And I was talking about mediation, and he was talking about conflict transformation. I was sneaking into his class, hiding in the back. And I was really, and it really made a lot of things to me, because so what he did is he talked about a case, and he chose a case where he was the mediator and the mediation failed. And I was so impressed. I hadn't heard this before. I was at the time already with a lot of diplomats that were giving all these speeches, and you know exactly the picture. You said the controlled mediator, and there comes this person with so many ideas and just presents a case where he basically didn't win the case. And I thought, this is exactly what it is. It's about being humble. And so I'm always in this, there's a UN high-level mediation training. So I had the honor to be there as a trainer. And there is this flip chart they have for all the trainers who come in. It's just a few, where you say, what are the key qualities of a mediator? And I'm towards the end of that class, and you see always it's listening, it's controlling, it's like getting this and this. And I will always write down park your ego. Because I've seen so many processes fail, mainly because of male egos. And here's a white male that's the opposite of it. Who's a humble person who really knows it's about the others, it's not about us. And I think that's about him. And then I want to pick up, you looked into the past, and I want to look into the future. So I think that fits, but you have to help me in how do we start looking into the future? I want to start in the present with a little video. It's very short. All right, that's where we are. And that's about the PowerPoint. So what I really wanted to say is the world is such a mess and so much out of order that we don't have the luxury to think what we do in the next 50 years. We have to just start now. And who's the we? I think the we is peace builders, peace researchers, everybody who thinks we should not let this planet basically die. And what I really think is that there has been this this movie. Have you seen this Hollywood blockbuster, Don't Look Up? If not, you should see it. I thought it was really bringing it all together because it showed this comet that comes to the Earth and is this fundamental destruction of the planet. And then it has all the features of how our field is also in. It has the scientists who warn, who say, we've seen this is destroying the planet. And we have the politicians, Marilyn Streep in this really fantastic role, like being like, what do I make for my constituency out of this? Is this really serious? Is this not serious? I don't care whether it's serious or not. It's about how do I get my voters to vote for me because of this? And then, of course, the media who just take it up and polarize everything. And then business and capitalism who tries to even out of the destruction of the world, tries to gain money. And this interrelation between science, politics, media, and business, I think is the reality we are in. And it also shows like how science in that movie has been some parts of science was co-opted to the political rhetoric, and the other part who didn't want to be co-opted was ridiculed basically, and was basically outlawed as like, these are the wrong scientists. So, and I think this is basically where we are at. And from the perspective, let's say, what are the biggest challenges we have now? And I think it's climate change, it's war and destruction and exclusion, and of course it's also health. But let me focus on climate change and war. And so I hope my notes are a bit as messy as the world, so bear with me. I think it is very interesting to look at climate change, both in a kind of interconnected way, like colleagues like Cedric also are doing, but also to learn from that field of action for us in our field. Because in climate change, we had science, and science was really pulling together the collective evidence. What is there to show politicians that the world is really going down the drain? And there's very few sort of there was, of course, contradictions, but I think they overcome that, and they have really a collective body of evidence that shows there's a coherence in the scientific response to climate change. The politicians have, as we know, made a little bit of movement, but not enough. But we have a very established movement, especially with Fridays for Futures. Also, the new generation come in and brought the Green parties in many countries into power and into parliament. And so there's a young dynamic that's going on in the climate change world. And there's, of course, the business community resisting to this change. So we have sort of the politicians in between, the movement pushing, and the science providing the evidence. We're not saying we are there yet, but I think it's very interesting to learn from that field and the coherence that is in there. So if we compare that to our field, where are we at? I think we are not there, kind of, because in terms of the evidence we have, I think we are not producing collective evidence. We are producing bits and pieces everywhere. If we look into the world of conflict, I'm not talking about Afghanistan because it's just too sad, but we know the story. But if we look at UN-led peace processes in the last 10 years, we had Libya as the only one where there was a peace agreement signed in the last 10 years. That's not a good record, and that one is very shaky. Look at the processes in Syria and Yemen, where there is a roadmap by the UN Security Council that is like followed like the Holy Grail, and everybody, if you talk to the UN teams there, to everybody around, to local, everybody thinks it's a non-starter. But we're just following it, the same roadmap, even if it's not working. We can go to places like Colombia, where some of you from, where we had a peace agreement, and there's so much struggle in implementation. But we can go further down the road. Let's look at, there's a lot of evidence, as you know, from colleagues on the early 90s peace processes and peace agreements. Look at Bosnia, where has this really produced inclusive societies? It's far away. So yeah, so it's like, I think we are very far away from, as a field, collectively claiming any like tremendous moves. So why is it like that? And I think I like that very much, what you said. It's not who can build peace, it's about what do we need to collectively do to do a better job. Okay, a couple of ideas. So the first thing, maybe more from a conceptual research point of view, and then what this means also from a sort of practitioner point of view. But they are interlinked, because I very much agree with the picture of the ecosystem. Because what happens is, interestingly, researchers always think they cannot influence change and politics, but we can, and we do all the time. And sometimes they take things from us, like I've written a piece, I remember well, on how Jean-Paul's track model has been helping to produce a peace industry, and how the middle out approach became the business component of the peace building field. We had, I think, I sent him the draft of that article at the time. He sent me 10 pages respondent. I thought like, okay, which helped me greatly shape it. And I had some really furious people calling me and saying like, how can you challenge Jean-Paul Elerac? And I said, first of all, he has done it himself in the moral imagination. I'm just referencing and sort of rubbing it in more. But the point is, I was not criticizing theory. I was criticizing the way it was interpreted as the holy grail of, now this is the peace building NGO world. This is what we do. Yeah, we find our local pets and we give them all the money. We go to the donors, give them money, and we don't support the ecosystem, but we support some elites in the capitals that speak our language and that are not the movements. Or I've been just with a political movement, let's call it like that, which is having a hard time at the moment. And they told us then that they don't know what to do at this stage of the movement because all the money goes to NGOs. And how do you fund a movement that is in a suppressed country where you can't be in country? And so think about that, what we have studied, what we have all written about it, the transformation of social movements into kind of professional NGOs, the INGOization of movements. And I'm there, I'm seeing it. And like, how to help these people not to do it? How to hold the movement together? What evidence do we have? How can we show that it's not the way? But then comes the donor and say, if you're not an NGO with an address, we can't fund you. So we are in this. So what is it, what we need to do? I think the first thing we need to do is fundamentally change our assumptions and deconstruct a lot of our theories and concepts. And the first one is, of course, the way we are teaching and we are training and we are writing about peace building as a linear thing that somehow comes from negative peace miraculously to positive peace in a straight line. And then you have seen, I mean, no mediation and negotiation training, so there is this conflict phases. And I always feel like in an economics lecture where when I was a student and was also looking into this, and I always thought like, I don't get the economic understanding of the world, because you put all these things and theories out and you say, okay, they only work under the condition that A, B, C, D, E, F, G is not there, means reality. And that's basically how a big part of the constructions of our theory building is. We exclude reality. So, of course, not all of them. And it's like, some of them, but that means we can't live with that linearly. Like, I think Galtung's notion of negative and positive peace is brilliant. I love the 69 article. It's just brilliant. But what we as a field have not managed is to fill the gap. What is in between negative and positive peace? Is it just the liberal peace out there that creates these wonderful democracies? But how do we get there in this messiness? And how do we understand that it's not about success and failure? We have to stop talking about success and failure. It's so discouraging if you tell people, oh, you haven't succeeded. This was a failure. Analyze yourself. Take a log frame to do that. No, it is about understanding that resistance is not just civic resistance to authoritarian regimes. It's resistance of authoritarian regimes and armed actors to stay in power. And governments. So there is many different interpretations of resistance, and it means going forward and going backwards is just normal. Helping people to understand it's the norm that you make gains and you go backwards and you go forward and backward all the time. Christine Bell's team at the Political Settlement has this wonderful graphic, I'm using it a lot, about sort of the peace processes from the early 90s. And you see all these lines, it looks like this. That's the reality. If you processes go like this, and if you, for example, in Colombia have a setback in your process, that's normal. Just face it and say it's just normal. So what do we do? What can be done? That's the question. It's not like, oh, we lost it, we failed. Where did we do wrong? No, it's about what's the ecosystem? Why is this element in the ecosystem stronger? And we know it. How can we counteract that? What kinds of energies do we have and strategies to do that? And who's the we? How do we influence the ecosystem's we's? So it's really about that. I would like to also deconstruct a number of other concepts just on the side. Let's take peace agreements. Peace agreements, yes, they're okay if we have them, fine. So we can have them. But the point is there's so many types of sort of mechanism that make a society agree on something. Peace agreement is one thing. There's constitution reform processes. There's national dialogues. There's so many different spaces where societies on different levels have important historical moments where change happens. Peace agreement is one of them. So if we see that, this whole notion about who sits at the table, who participates, it's kind of not relevant. The relevance is how can the ecosystem influence change at a given moment in what kind of structures and mechanisms that make most sense. Let me see what's on my deconstruction list. I have tackled them all. No, I think let me move to reconstruction. So if this all is not peace building. What is peace building? Okay, the concept at the moment is in my mind. That might be a temporary thing, as Jean-Paul said. I call it perpetual peace building. And that peace building is the permanent renegotiation of the social and political contract in societies. And that means it's also not happening somewhere in a messed up conflict place. It happens all the time in France, when President Macron came up with his reform package, after he was overwhelmingly given a mandate to change so many things. And then he came up and then people said, no, not my pension system, not this one. And you have seen this big riots in Paris on the streets. People were dying in Paris on the streets. And the government first reacted extremely violent, sending out the police forces. And after all this didn't work and voters sort of support went so down, they started a national dialogue in France 3 years ago, where Macron himself went around also from community to community, discussed with people, so what's the problem with the reform package? And they basically came up with a new one. And I mean, the US is so in need of having a national dialogue. Black Lives Matter has shaken something, but it's such a long way to go to get this polarized society together. So you don't have to go into an armed conflict area. But let's talk about, we are working a lot in Ethiopia, for example, where all the attention was on the conflict in Tigray. And what it means to look into the ecosystem was, where are there possibilities? Like I look at Jonathan, where I know Conciliation Resource is doing a great job in sort of the Somali region to just look like what's working there. We were trying to get actors together who wanted a national dialogue, and everybody said, this is not gonna have a national dialogue. We have to fix the conflict. Coming in and showing the evidence. You know, national dialogues have taken place in parallel of armed conflicts. You can get actors on board in a slow press. It's possible. Going around and trying to, we have given so many inputs on evidence in embassies, in DC, in, you know, name it, to tell the internationals also, you need to change your language. It's not only about polarized language. Let's give a bit of hope in your language. And we help to change a lot of those sort of statements of the EU, the US, and suddenly there was always national dialogue in the statements. Then something interesting happened. So we were like, oh, hey, we made it. We influenced them. Are we good? And then the Ethiopians came to us and says, this is so, I mean, taking away ownership of us. Now all the internationals talk about national dialogue. And we're like, oh God, what did you do? So then how do you get it back, the narrative, to helping that this is a nationally owned process? You stay out, you internationals. Yes, but support. And it was really a process. We had to take people by the hand, especially the internationals, to make them understand literally how to write a statement that is not taking away national ownership. Yeah, it's a difference between we, the US, want a national dialogue in Ethiopia, or we, the US, are happy to see that Ethiopian actors are coming together too, you know? It's sometimes so banal, but it makes such a difference. I wanted to just for a moment come to Ukraine. I think it's this morning in the BBC, there was the first two news. Of course, the first one is always Ukraine. The second was that there has the biggest cut in trees and burning in the Amazon in Brazil has happened this last month. 1,000 square kilometers of rainforest have been cut down in 1 month. That was the second news. I think it really shows where we are, Ukraine and climate change. And on Ukraine, I mean, it's a very, very sad example of failed, in this case, I think it's a good word, preventative diplomacy. It's very sad to see that the polarization that goes on, and also leading experts, colleagues of us, will say, yes, more arms, which is maybe, you can debate that, if that's necessary or not. I'm not going into that. But more arms for all the European armies, more this, Putin has to do this, and Nobody, hardly anybody talks about, we need to renegotiate the peace and security architecture in Europe and globally, because the UN obviously the Security Council can't work under the conditions. The OSCE, I mean, we can debate whether it has ever like worked in particular context. It has really worked as a platform to bring Russia and others together. Why has this platform not delivered? Do we need to abolish it? Do we need to amend it? Do we need parallel platforms, other elements in the ecosystem? That's what we need to discuss. I had a couple of interviews out in newspapers. I tell you, people were writing to me on Twitter to say like, you are lunatic nuts. Basically, how can you talk to the devil? I mean, and we think like, oh my God, all these concepts. There's such a demonization going on, and there's totally no understanding. If you say, but there might be security interests of Russia, people say like, what, are you for Putin? And so we see the whole discourse in our society as if this and this, and we are now in the center of this in Europe. And people say, like, I had an article for a newspaper, and they said, you're not positioning yourself in this or that way. I'm like, wait a moment, we are trying to bring evidence and sense into the debate, and don't want to, as scientists, position ourselves in camp A or camp B. So what's going on here? It's crazy. So how, let me see. Where does it lead us? What do we do with all this? This polarized world of exclusion, of even, it's just getting worse and worse and worse. I think the first thing for me is, if we keep in the picture of the ecosystem, is collective action. But what does it mean? How would it look like? Let's start with scholars. What can we as scholars do? What can we just do? I think we can do a lot. I think we have to start from the essence of peace research. Because do we need peace research? Kind of no. My former director at the Graduate Institute would say no. And he rejected every single proposal to start a master's program in peace and conflict studies, because he said we are an IR school, and as such, we're treating that subject cross-disciplinary. That's okay. You can do that. So why do we need peace research? I think let's go back to why peace research was founded. The founding mothers and fathers basically said, we need peace research only because of one reason, and that's it's an intentional science. It has an intention to produce evidence that can change the world, if you want to say it in this kind of pathetic kind of formulation, but it's like, that's why peace research was founded. And much of the peace research in the Cold War, as you know, was geared towards basically bringing the science into the East-West conflict. And I think the point is, it's intentional. We cannot just hide behind the science. No, we have to do something with it. And it doesn't mean that everybody, all of us, have to instantly run around like Jean-Paul and I do and talk to practitioners. No, that's not the point. The point is of how do we get our collective evidence together for the cause? We have a lot of area studies, and we will hear a lot of interesting presentations also today on different aspects. How do we get all these research findings together? How do we get them together in making a case for the cause? What group of people have to come together and say, we need to start somewhere, and getting this evidence together to show, and not just having expert A, expert B, expert C talking to the media on subject, whatever. Having a collective of responsible, I call that, peace scholars that's still committed to the cause, and say everything we do and we research will contribute, but how exactly, we need to find out. We need to get coherence in it. It's not every country has the luxury like you have in the UK with these big research projects. But of course, they can't tackle everything. But we need to set priorities and say, what do we want to achieve now and in the next 5 years? And what kind of messages we as a scientific community want to put out there to the field? We have to speak with collective voices. So that's the intentional science. And what can practitioners do? I mean, they can join the movement, of course, the intentional movement. And of course, the problem is most of them, they think they're already on the track because they are the ones doing it. But I think there is this issue, and I'm not elaborating on all the challenges in the peace practitioner field, but because of the sort of peace industry that we have created, and the very fact that if you don't get funding, it's very hard to move the cause. It's because we have lost the connection to the movement we once were. There are movements in many parts of the world, and very brave movements. I'm always like fascinated by the Sudanese that just don't give up. No matter what happens, just go back to the street. But not everybody can even do it because some authoritarian spaces are so violently shrinking the space that people can't even go to the streets. I've just worked 10 days with a movement that is in that situation. And it's very hardening how you can see how they're losing the influence to there. We know from evidence, if you are too long in exile, you're losing the home connection. So what can we do? But what we don't have a peace movement. Do we need one? I'm not sure. I don't think we need a traditional peace movement that goes around peace on earth, because nobody will listen to us, because it has to always something specific, something that's attractive to people at that very moment where they can put their cause in it. There's so much stupidity going on Instagram and Twitter. I've lately joined Instagram just to see what are people doing. It's fascinating. I mean, besides that, I follow my kids. And then I call them and say like, well, I have just seen that your cat got lost. Very important information. Why don't you tell me? Why I have to read it on Instagram? And or when Kim Kardashian lost her diamond earring while swimming. I mean, so many sad people around the world. There's an enormous potential, isn't there? We should not say the stupid bloggers. No, we should say, how can we make them intentional? How can we show them that you can talk about your earring and you can have your Prada bag, and at the same time, you can have other things that you also think that are important. It's not just making them like worse because they are like this. No, there are so many. And there are so many movements in the world. There's Fridays for Future. There's no Fridays for a peaceful future. I think we need to go back and think, and I don't have the immediate answer, but I'm working on it. How do we build movements that support the ecosystem? It's almost like a positive Me Too, where we say Me Too came together, united people under a negative thing. How can we create a positive Me Too that deliberately is not controlled, that deliberately has those ecosystems where in some countries under the same label, people might think like, well, we're doing this particular thing now. In others, it's a label. And I think we need to get to this, and we need to join hands and bring sort of the spider web, it's like in this, together. And that is not working if it's not intentional. It is not happening, but just saying like, it's all coherent, it's all beautiful. It's not. There's also lots of power relations. If we would only start, my God, I mean, think about a couple of guys coming together, thinking about who's leading the movement. So it's also being real and thinking about how can we, in a world full of power, we will not get away with just having a powerless movement. No, it has to be powerful. But how can we avoid the egos? And they will come. How can we bring the collective together and sort of do a lot of things together and join forces, really? I think this is what I think we need to do. And we together will have answers. And I think that's what we need to do. Scientists need to get together and think about what we do with our collective evidence and what evidence we need for what kind of cause, which is not belittling other evidence that might not be relevant for this particular cause. And we need, as peace building community, come more together and think about how do we get out of some circles we are in? How can we educate our donors? If we can't educate them, then we use the same means like they use. We influence the media, we influence the movements, we backmouth them in parliament. There's means. They use strategies. Why can't we use them? I mean, how come that communication is such an underdeveloped thing in our field. It's like, I have been working once with one country in Asia, actually the Philippines, and you know, President Duterte is super unpopular in the West, very popular, many in some parts of the Philippines. But what I found fascinating, it was in the mediation between the Norwegian-led mediation between the communist movement and the government. And I was an advisor to this process. And then came the communication team, and they had some exchange also with the FARC communication advisors. And the FARC communication advisor told them what they did with the FARC and stuff. And then these guys came, made a PowerPoint to say like, well, you know, we're thinking 10 years ahead. Here's our campaign to win over parliament. Here's our campaign to win over business community. Here's our campaign. I was like, wow, this is it. This is this long-term communication thinking. They were thinking about how we do this in schools? How do we do this in social media? It was a whole bunch of political communication people that were basically lent to the peace process. And I have never seen such professionality around. And I think that's what we're lacking. And it would be so easy to do that. If you can sell, have George Clooney drink coffee and say, buy Nespresso. While we know the coffee is kind of okay, but not really good. It's 10 times more expensive. It creates immense environmental pollution, and you're even getting a kind of metal poisoning over time because of this blobbing of the capsules. But you can sell it. It's the best seller of Nestle. It has overtaken chocolate sales by Nestle. We need to sell peace, and we can do it. So what I want, I simply want that you join me in this, and let's get inspired by each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya, for very rich reflections on our current plight, informed also by very considerable experience working in the field, as well as, of course, a very strong base of scholarship too. I think very complementary presentations. Liz, as you're leaving the room, I recognize that we're at the end of the hour, this designated time to bring this to a close. Is there time for quick reflections? I don't want to meddle with the timetable that's been very carefully plotted out, but I'm in your hands if you think that we can afford a few minutes of a reaction from members of the audience.
If we take, am I coming over?
Well enough.
If we take 10 minutes from
very good. I think we
coffee,
have, okay,
then
let's
we
do
have
that.
a very quick 20-minute coffee break.
Okay, and if you
So there
keep
is something.
your comments brief, it'll enable others to speak. So please bear that in mind. We've got a roving mic here. I don't know whether I thought we had two. But if you want to raise your hand, if you have anything that you'd like to say in reaction on the themes that have been raised today, any thoughts at all? I mean, a lot of ground has been covered. There's a hand up here. I feel like I'm an auctioneer. Or two, maybe. Was it you also, Cedric, or? No, okay.
I don't really have a question. I just want to say thank you. I lived in Ukraine from 2017 to 2020 when I was evacuated, and I'm a current Rotary Peace Scholar at Bradford University studying project management. And so when you spoke about Ukraine and peace negotiations, and I've studied Ukraine historically, it's just been frustrating to see this unfold in a country and be so connected to so many people who are dealing with this atrocity. And I'm like, we're studying peace in a time, and how was this not preventable? And how do we move forward from here? And I'm so connected to so many people who are fleeing the country, who are hiding in basements. And I speak to my kids, and it's been very difficult for this past year watching the troops being built up along the border, and it was not prevented. So I want to say thank you for mentioning something. And as we move forward, I just want to continue to have optimism and hope and a vision of an independent, autonomous Ukraine, and how these actions and these studies can prevent these things from happening in the future. So thank you for mentioning that. I appreciate that.
let's move the mic along and then we'll allow speakers to respond to any of the comments they wish to. If there's anything, yes, there's in this.
Thank you. My name is Julieta Dodge, Peace Fellow from Bradford University as well. It's good to see Professor Brandon Lassoy in Kampala. So it's concern is when it comes to peace researchers. I've worked in Northern Uganda born and raised and worked there and experienced the unfold of everything in Northern Uganda. But the continuous frustration for practitioners is when it comes to peace researchers, the in and out. Peace researchers will come for probably months or a year. We get the information, but that information never comes back to the grassroots. So it will inform, as you say, the ones that sit at parliament and make decisions, the ones that sit at The Hague or that sit around the tables at the UN headquarters. But the last person down there who has to live with a massacre site day in and day out, or has to live with a brother understanding the concept of Northern Uganda, they don't have the solutions. And not, most of them do not have access to the beautiful publications that we write and have on different channels. But also constantly, as I was doing my master's, which I just finished, is reading all this beautiful literature on transitional justice. But the question for me is, where are the practitioners in the space of peace research? The voices are not there. And yet I feel that, and I see from that background that there is more that can be informed. So when you talk about inclusive peace, and thank you, Paul Lederach and Dr. Tiana, I've read your work and it's influenced my master's, but that constant evolution, we are stuck to concepts that have been created. Let's look at transitional justice. When you look at the different concepts of, it's the aspect of repair, but when does repair start and when does repair stop? And how do we influence the circle of funding? Because most funding at most you get for peace building 5 years, and that's maximum. But peace building after several years of conflict cannot end after 5 years. So what happens after that? So if we could start looking more into these discussions that actually bring practical change on ground and not it having to influence only the intellectuals, I think that would be a good process and way to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Richard, I have a question from YouTube. So
yes, okay.
Very quickly, I think it's for John Paul Lederach, and it's from Peter Immanuel, saying that he would like to hear how you could answer the question that Tanya posed to us, that how do we sell peace?
Thank you for that. And yes?
Thank you very much. This is Mohammed. I come from Syria. I think the industry of peace and the current peacemaking or peace, I don't know where we are in Syria, but I think it's still a very long process of, I find the Syria I don't know, this is peacemaking process has gone astray with the different tracks that are going on, and the great frustration that Syrians are feeling towards the peacemaking process in Syria. And I think as a Syrian, I don't know where to start with this overwhelming frustration. I believe that the recent polarization with Russia as a key stakeholder in the Syrian conflict could be a window for a breakthrough for maybe a stronger leadership from the UN, from the EU or the US. Like I've participated recently in the preparation for Brussels conference for Syria, but I think it just we're in a vicious cycle. We're just repeating ourselves and not going anywhere. So I would like to get your feedback on this frustrating peacemaking process. Thank you.
Maybe we can take one more comment. I think behind you there was, or did you see somebody? Oh, there. Okay, good.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Peter Cousins. Thank you for the presentations. I think in both of them, I heard sort of you talking about like in sort of like moving away from the idea of sequentiality and sort of linear. I think that came up in both of your talks. And I'm sure there'd be kind of many things you could take from that and sort of ideas that could flow from that. But the first one that came to my mind, just sort of partly on the basis of a bit of facilitation experience and so forth, means that I don't know if that is permission to get things wrong as well a bit more easily. I mean, not that necessarily that needs to be our goal, but like, I wonder if there's any sort of, if there's something that comes from that sort of the fear of processes going wrong. Perhaps moving away from sequentiality might free us from that a little bit. Thank you.
Why don't we pause, give a chance to the speakers if you'd like to respond to any of the comments that you've heard. Make sure that works first. Does it work? I don't think so. Is it on?
I think it will work now. Okay, good. Well, first, thank you for the comments and questions. They will go beyond our few minutes, or you won't get coffee, which could be another level of conflict, perhaps. So I think there may be a couple that I can speak to, but and that Tanya, a number of these. I would speak just from my personal journey once again. There was a point in my life, probably 25 years ago, where I made a decision vis-a-vis donors, which was that I would not involve myself in processes unless they committed to 10 years of funding. My actual view was they should commit to a half century in places where there are half-century wars, but I couldn't get them to think beyond projects of 1 to 3 years. So I pushed for decade thinking. But it also did something for me personally, which was I had to make commitments to do longer in fewer places. That was, all of us have different things that we do. So the latter part of my work has really been to stay with people and situations to the degree that I can for longer. It hasn't meant for a wide variety of family reasons always living exactly there, but committed in Colombia since the late 80s. That's a bright light. There would be a way to dim that. It would be nice. Thank you. And Nepal was, a decade that went to 15 years. And essentially what it permits, it has something to do with the in-betweenness that I was talking about. That so much when it's extractive and in and out, I think was part of what you were saying, events become extraordinarily important from which the content is extracted. And then the deep sense of deception is that the people that are actually at the core of the innovation are no longer in the conversation, no longer have ownership of the very ideas and initiatives that they had. When you commit for multiple decades, it feeds, you find ways that your only thought process is how does this feed with and back into, and that the people who are actually proximate to it really have the ownership of it, which I think might be, so one of the questions on how to sell peace, I don't know. I pretty much have failed in most of that because I have tended to be very much, I have not involved myself in Instagram and what's the other thing? I'm on WhatsApp, which has been very interesting. But one of the things I've been learning, this is particularly true from work and engagement in the United States, which is something Tanya brought up. Her formulation, by the way, helps enormously to see this as a global phenomenon, not exclusive to particular countries. And that's been one of our biggest challenges. We can easily see it elsewhere, but never look in our own backyards. In communities that I've had opportunity to be alongside of that are struggling with deep forms of violence in the United States, one of the concepts they work with is the idea of credible messengers. Credible messengers are actually people who are come from experiences that permit them to have forms of conversations that others can't. So ecosystem-wise, it's not that you try to find the flash, it's how do you support the people who are in the best position to really make a difference in ways that matter. And I personally have found that to be people who are more proximate to realities where they live. So how do you think, this is why I think the concept of alongsideness ought to be at the core of our teaching. How do we lead from alongside? Not how do we lead by pushing ahead and giving money for 1 year and expecting everything to happen, not from leading out ahead where we somehow have the magic solution, but actually a form of accompaniment that stays with it for as long as it's needed. And that, for me, is why I moved to words like permanent. It becomes a lifelong vocation. And I think that's been the hard part on some of this, but I'll let Tanya speak because we're busy.
Thank you. I think the first thing is to start with yourself, like you just described, like what is your decision on this? For me, and I'm not talking now about all my journey, but has been quite an education to be in this field as I'm come from a mixed race, mixed religious, mixed whatsoever background. And I'm a woman, I'm a mother, and I had to embrace that. It took me a while to say, this is an opportunity. And not like I'm in the wrong space, I'm always from the wrong race, I'm always from the wrong thing. When I started, I was just surrounded by men, interestingly, still a lot. So, but the thing is to embrace who you are and say, what are these opportunities that you personally have and what you can bring, and what you can bring will change over time. 20 years ago, it was different for me. I, for example, thought if I'm hopping around from context to context, just inspiring people when they need it, that was my approach. And I'm still doing that, but I'm also doing much more accompaniment and staying in some context longer, because I feel like it's this reconnection and feeling and sensing. So especially bringing in this, and that's personal choices. Are we more on this side, on the hardcore evidence side? Are we more on this side, on that side? That's choices we make and they might change, but be conscious about them and see your strength. I think that's the first thing. The second is, and I'm using the Syria case for like, how our thinking shapes the reality. If I think Syria in a perpetual peace building way, that it's a renegotiation of the social contract that started with the revolution. And I've learned recently, you're not even allowed in some circles to talk about the revolution as a revolution, I know. So forgive me if I'm using the wrong term. But that has been a good starting point. And then it was drawn back. And then it was tried to be fixed with a fixing approach. And we are still in the fixing approach. We're not in the approach. This is a very tough political transition. And it takes obviously more than one generation even, but hopefully it will be, the violence can stop. What does it take? Obviously, to be very honest and reality-based, what I heard from you is that you said like, oh, there's this opportunity maybe with Russia. Okay, what does it exactly mean? But then you said the UN. I'm not so sure if sort of the actor that has for 10 years it's not the fault of the UN. I'm not saying that, but is in that frame of the resolution on the Geneva agreements of doing the process in this way and not in an ecosystem way. No, it's fighting for its linear thinking of the approach. They're still thinking of who do we need to get together this time in order to. It's not going to work. And we know it's not going to work. So where's the creativity that you as Syrians can bring into play to say, okay, this obviously, we can't say it's a failure because it was worth a try, yeah, but it hasn't worked so far. What else is there? What other opportunities we can create? And painting your own map of the process in Syria, thinking about what's your own creative ideas, what can out of this, and who needs to be part of these conversations? How do you start them? I think it's about really rethinking the process. And I think that's what I think is the only way of getting forward. And I think I just wanted to one comment on the researchers, what you mentioned. I had heard this critique a lot, and I think we need to differentiate between what types of research are done where, but I think there should be a research ethical code of bringing things back. Because it's like, I have heard a lot of researchers that have done researchers in Africa, for example, done enormous data collection, and then they were even excluded from the analysis, why they had so much to say from the analysis. And then there is this footnote in the journal ethic, we thank so-and-so for this nice data collection. This is not the way we can do it, yeah? So it's about joint analysis, it's about co-authoring, things like that. That's the pragmatic side of it. But it's like, that's what I mean if I connect it to my sort of thesis of the intentional research. What is this research in Northern Uganda for? Okay, one reason is to provide evidence, for example, for maybe transitional justice in the future. Fine, collect the evidence, get it feedback, feed it back to the people what you have found, get that feedback into your evidence and deliver it. Fine. Is there research that wants to give sort of creative ideas to the communities on the spot? That's a different objective, but it should also happen. So there's different types of research that can happen at the different time. But we have to stop being obsessed like, oh, if we give something back, that sounds like it's applied research. It's not basic research. Is that like too involved? If you don't like it, is it what? We have to drop these categories and just say it's intentional. And to be in a community and to feed back to people doesn't mean you have to be academically not rigor. Who tells us this? Because it's always deconstructed as, oh, this is not rigor and this is rigor. We can be rigor, and I really like to be academically rigor, but we can still be participatory and feedback.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry we don't have time for more comments, questions. It's clear that we could go on for some time with this, but I would like to invite you to join me in thanking our speakers for their contribution.
And may we make the coffee break not more than 15 minutes, please? So be very snappy. Thank you.